They're more hunched over, they're not as tall, they're more aggressive, and different things like that behaviorally that show us there's something else going on down in the south.
From haunted houses to alien invasions, from true crime to pure chaos, we bring you the fear and the fun, only on Panic TV. If this made you scream, this made you hide, and this made you doubt reality, buckle up for this one.
I've been a UPS driver for 34 years, and on my UPS route, I will occasionally run into people, and I probably have met at least 25 in those years. I will jokingly say something like, man, if Fought Monster don't live back in these woods, then he ought to be ashamed of himself. And they're like, well, you ought to be here when the sun goes down. And then they'll relate to me a story as to what's happened. So I said 25 credible people. Law enforcement people, people who run grocery stores, just your whole walk of life, people who've seen this creature. When they tell people, they kind of think, well, you're crazy, and they kind of quit telling people. But these are people that after they open up to you, and they show the same amount of emotion that I feel when they tell you this story. As I've begun to study this creature, which I find he's so fascinating because he's very, very smart. He can outthink you in a lot of ways, but I find a lot of times I'll find family groups. I'll find big 16, 17-inch tracks, and I'll find something 14-inch, and I'll find something maybe 5 to 6-inch tracks. Where you'll have a male, and it looks to be a male and a female. You see the female where she's carrying more weight, and then all of a sudden she doesn't carry that weight, but then like I said, here's your little bitty tracks right here beside you. So there is a breeding population. And it's a very real animal, as real as deer, as real as bears. It just hasn't been found and hasn't been classified. And you don't have a Fought Monster sighting when you want to. You have a sighting when he wants you to. And that's kind of the best way to put it.
So let's talk about your latest experience. We discussed that a little bit, and it's really a quite striking incident. You said you were coming down, you're looking for firewood, is that right? Can you take me through what happened that day?
Well, it was about this time at night, or the afternoon, and I pulled my old Jeep down here in the woods and got my chainsaw and started cutting up some firewood. And it was right at 2 years ago, the day before one of my sons was born. And I wanted firewood for the winter, so I was cutting up all these logs that I was finding in the woods and stacking them in my Jeep. And as I made my way through the bushes, I heard a cry that sounded kind of like a child. And so I started making my way through the brush to see what it was, to see if there was a lost kid out here. And as I made my way closer to the source of the cry, it was getting louder and louder till it almost turned into a scream. And then when I got to it through the bushes and could actually see it, I was amazed that it was a juvenile Bigfoot, probably about 5 foot tall, maybe a little shorter than 5 foot, and covered in hair, surprisingly human in the face. But the brow ridges and the cheekbones and the nasal bone was more pronounced than a human. But other than that, surprisingly human.
And it was standing upright?
Standing upright, looking at me.
Okay.
And as I started talking to him, trying to calm him down, because he was really, really hysterical at that point. And I took a couple of steps at him, and when I did, he started moving away into the swamp. And I kept following him saying, "You don't have to be afraid, little guy, come over here and I'll give you some candy or something," trying to talk as nice and low as I could to calm him. But he never calmed. He was scared to death of me. And as I kept moving closer, he finally ended up into the marsh and started walking off into the lake. And he got behind a cypress tree. And he put his hand up on the side of the cypress tree and was looking around the tree at me. And at that time, you could see how big and bony his hands were. And I said, I got to get a witness for this because nobody's going to believe this. So I got back in my truck and I went home and got my wife, which would have our son the next day.
So,
And,
I mean, obviously this was a emergency circumstance.
Yes, and she didn't appreciate being drug out here in the marsh when she's 9 months pregnant and already in labor, but I had to try to get somebody else to see it.
Right.
And I had my boat in the truck, so I unloaded it. I was going to try to head him off and run him back in across this road over here. So I got off in there and my wife stayed in the truck watching. And at that point you could hear, I guess, Mom and Dad coming. And they were getting angry because they could hear their baby boy crying. They knew he was in distress.
So
And,
the sound you heard coming, I mean, how describe
it
that?
sounded like it was 400 or 500 yards away at first, but they started getting louder and louder, and it was getting closer. So I was trying to get the little baby herded back into shore and get him back on land where we could get a good picture of him. But by the time I got around, he had got around the boat and went over to the other side where the mound is and disappeared into the brush over there. So I stayed there. I could still hear him yelling. So I stayed there for a little bit, but then Mom and Dad was getting louder and louder. So I started worrying about my wife at that point. So I turned the boat around and came back to her, and I got back on shore and I looked at the truck and nobody's in it. I'm like, oh, where's my wife at? And so I run to the truck and saw her. She was hiding in the floorboard of the truck.
Really?
She had heard the sound of the big ones coming and it scared her, so she rolled the windows up and locked the doors and hid in the floorboard of the truck. But it was a very wild experience.
So at that point, did you, I mean, you obviously were frightened of the sound of something you couldn't see.
Yes.
I mean, were you fearful? Obviously you had your pregnant wife there,
Yes.
so you had this kind of up the ante for protecting your family.
Yes, I felt like we was in a dangerous situation at that point. You could feel the yell of the adults when they were coming in, and by that time you could hear splashes of the footprints coming in from the other directions. Like one was to the east and one was to the west of us, and they were closing in, and you could hear them so loud that you could feel it by that point. And so I figured maybe if Junior wasn't involved, they wouldn't be that aggressive, but the way they were coming in sounded pretty aggressive, so we decided to leave at that point.
Okay.
There are plenty of obvious places to look for Sasquatch. Mountain ranges, deep forests, national parks. But the swamps of North America might be some of the wildest, most overlooked regions in that search. At one time, the U.S. was home to over 220 million square miles of wetlands, humid, overgrown, nearly impassable stretches of wilderness. Though much has been lost to development, what remains is still teeming with life. Reptiles, amphibians, birds, and mammals thrive in this dense, tangled world. It's not just the wildlife we know that call the swamps home. Across the continent, from the Carolinas to Texas and up through the Midwest, eyewitnesses report encounters with something that defies easy classification. While Bigfoot is often seen as a creature of the Pacific Northwest, there's a long history of swamp-bound sightings. These regions, with their natural concealment, abundant food, and sparse human population, are tailor-made for something that doesn't want to be found. The idea of Sasquatch using the swamps as a refuge makes a certain kind of sense. These environments are hostile, remote, and resource-rich, ideal for a large, intelligent animal looking to avoid detection. And the people who live in and around these places? They've got the stories to prove it. Not every Bigfoot lives in a bog, sure, but we'd be foolish to rule it out.
I saw something. I don't know what it was. I was a skeptic of Bigfoot until I saw what I saw. I think there's things out in the woods that we've not seen, that people haven't seen. They find new species all the time. You know, and granted, it may be little things, it may be underwater things, but I think feasibly there's something out there that scientists have not seen.
In my opinion, a swamp is the perfect place for a cryptid because they're typically more remote. They're places that are not as developed. You know, these lowlands, the bottomlands are, you know, something where over time, a portion of those are just as they were when settlers came to America. Swamps are also, you know, a place where I think these creatures can find sustenance. You've got everything you need. You've got water, food, you know, seclusion, everything that these things would need. And of course, if we're considering Sasquatch, these are big creatures. You know, you're going to need a lot of food to sustain yourself. So swamps are the perfect place, and a place where over time, I think as we develop this country, that, you know, they can remain relatively hidden, relatively remote, just as they have been all along. So you mentioned you've been a hunter for most of your life. Can you tell me a little bit about your background in hunting?
Yeah, I've been hunting since I was 13. Bow hunting, muzzleload, rifle hunting. Hunted from Georgia to Texas to Colorado.
The experience you mentioned when you were in the tree stand, can you take me through what happened that morning?
Yeah, I hung my climbing stand in the woods the day before. I found some big oak trees that were dropping acres. So I hung my climbing stand just like I needed to be to get in the next morning and climb up as quiet as possible. Went in with my little green light, got to the stand. The stand was twisted around all backwards, and like something was messing with it, but they didn't steal it. I figured public hunting, you can't leave your stuff out. But it was twisted around, so I just got in it, straightened it up, and climbed in. And it was a full moon. It was probably an hour before daylight, and I heard something coming up beside me. So I just slowly looked over, and it was two objects. They looked like cows at first because they were on all fours, and clouds were moving in and out, so you could see 1 second, and then it'd get a little darker. But I mean, it was close. It was probably 15 foot away. And as I'm sitting there, well, I was talking to myself like, "Oh, we got cows. What's cows doing in here? I think, you know, somebody's cows must have got loose or whatever." And they got closer. I'm like, well, maybe they're hogs. Maybe I can get to shoot a hog with my bow. Well, when they got under me, they started talking a bunch of gibberish, like meow, 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 meow. And then one of them reached up, touched my side of my leg, went down. I think he grabbed my climbing stand. He reached up because I had my bow in my lap, my arrow sticking out in front of me. He reached up. I didn't see a pinky, but I saw the 3 fingers and the thumb. The finger was probably that big around, and there were no pigmentation. It was all shiny, coal black fingers. He reached up, grabbed my arrow, and when it did, I guess it cut him. because he started hollering. It sounded, you know, like a bull or something you hear out in the field. He hollered super loud. I pulled my hair off, started cussing. You know, I was like, what the heck is this? And then he just hollered all the way down to the bayou, crashing, and then I heard it cross the creek. And I guess I just sat there in shock for about 30 minutes until it got daylight and said, well, I don't think I'm gonna see any deer this morning. So I got my climbing stand and got in the truck and left. And after that, I mean, I didn't bow hunt for like 6 years.
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously that's at least you're up in a tree stand, but you're vulnerable. I mean, they're under you, and whatever this creature might be, just based on how high you were sitting and how high it reached, do you have a guess as to how tall this creature was?
I'm figuring he was probably, I don't think he was big as a lot of people say they see, but I know the bottom of the stand was probably 12 foot off the ground, because the only tree I found in there had a fork in it, and my climbing stand couldn't go up past the fork in the tree. So I'm guessing. Now the size of the fingers, you know, I mean, being that big around, you'd think he was 10 foot tall or something. I mean, there's no way of knowing.
Sure. So, I mean, after that occurred, obviously you're somewhat in shock. You know, this is not your average day of hunting.
Yeah.
You know, what was going through your mind just trying to process this?
I have no idea. I think I was just sitting there staring into space for about 30 minutes, an hour, and then finally woke up like, what the heck just happened? And I'm not gonna see any deer, so I might as well leave.
All right. And what was the approximate date of that?
I'm thinking it was somewhere around 2001.
Okay. And, you know, just to give a sense of, like, how far would you say you were from the bayou channel, from where your tree stand was?
I'm gonna guess probably 100 yards. I mean, it didn't take him long to get there and splash across that morning, but he was hollering and tearing trees down, and he was getting there fast. So
Right.
I'm guessing probably 100 yards.
All right, you know, and that's definitely one of the things that was, you know, popularized by the movie He Always Travels the Creeks. But if you truly do investigate these sightings, and that's the reason I asked this, is because you find that there's a pattern of sightings all along these waterways. And, you know, what they said so long ago, you know, which makes a great movie, it is actually true.
So when it comes to the idea, why would a swamp or a marsh or some sort of a wetland be a potential area where something like a Sasquatch could live? And I think it's pretty simple for the most part. A lot of these swamps are pretty hard to get into. They're remote habitats. They're places where people to this day, if you look at like areas in Florida or Georgia or other parts of the South, Louisiana, Mississippi, you know, the Atchafalaya Basin, whatever swamp habitat you look at, they've been preserved. Sure, a lot of them have been destroyed, but a lot of these large swamp areas like the Everglades, they're now protected land, and they're areas where people generally haven't gone. Even prior to the United States, a lot of Native American groups didn't really venture that far into some of these swamps. They had a sort of mystical aura. The Spanish barely went into any of the swamps when Florida was part of you know, the Spanish Empire, when they colonized Florida. From my understanding and my research into the Everglades, they never really penetrated very deeply into the Everglades. They kind of just went in the peripheries of the state of Florida, or what we now consider to be the state of Florida. But habitat-wise, swamps provide so much sustenance, nutrition, food sources. So in mountainous areas, typically your food sources are going to be larger. You know, whether if you're hunting, you've got larger animals, maybe elk, deer, moose, that sort of stuff. Smaller varmints. Whereas down in the swamps, you know, and this is something I learned while I was in Louisiana. I was in the Atchafalaya Basin with Scott Tompkins of the Bigfoot Mapping Project, and he was showing me all these little species of fish, and you see the crawdads down there, little snakes, lizards, all sort of stuff in the swamp that could be sustenance for any kind of creature that's scavenging. You know, you have, I think, more food sources in like 1 square mile in a swamp in Louisiana or say Florida than you would have in a mountainous area in the Appalachians or the Rocky Mountains, right?
Well, when it comes to swamps, there's a lot of what I would consider hot spots. Some of the main ones would be the Hockomock Swamp, Massachusetts. Of course, the Everglades in Florida with the skunk ape. There is the Great Dismal Swamp over in the east. Caddo Lake, which is a swampy area between Texas and Louisiana. Honey Island Swamp down in Louisiana, if you want to consider the Honey Island Swamp Monster as a Sasquatch. And many other just small or large swamps around North America where you have typically a concentration of Sasquatch sightings.
And I think this is something that's really interesting if you look at like black bear patterns, or black bear that live in, say, parts of the Appalachians even, or in the southern US, they have more food. Their range is actually smaller. This is something that Matt Pruitt had told me, that their range is a lot smaller than bears that live in more mountainous areas out west, because the resources are a lot closer. So yeah, again, if a Sasquatch could exist in a swamp, a lot of people think it would be kind of strange. This is something that I struggled with the first few times we went to Florida in the Everglades. I'm like, man, I don't know. Florida's been exploding with population. There are over 20 million at this point, but if you look at where the population is, they're primarily on the coasts, and there's a few interior areas, but most people are on the coast. And you look at, like I was mentioning, the Everglades habitat, Big Cypress, and some of these areas combined, it's like almost twice the size of the state of Rhode Island, and it's basically just rural. There's nothing out there. So that's a lot of habitat, and for something, an ape-like creature to live in a swamp, it might kind of seem unusual, and I struggled with this idea at first. But why would something want to live in such a wet, kind of humid, disgusting environment with a lot of hair? Wouldn't that be uncomfortable? And then I saw black bear across the road in the Big Cypress Preserve, and then we found Florida panther tracks. So you have two animals that primarily, if you look at them in North America, so mountain lions and black bears, they live in a variety of habitats, deserts, mountains, but primarily mountainous areas, right? But they have adapted to living in this very marshy, swampy area, and they thrive, actually.
I just lost 10 years of my life. Oh, but it was worth it.
Between the twin coasts of central Florida, a creature known as the skunk ape pervades local chit-chat. A great many people that live between the twin coasts of the Sunshine State have heard the term, even if they aren't familiar with the mythology itself, or even the Sasquatch phenomenon in general. Though mythology might be too broad of a term, as the skunk ape's existence is backed up by multiple eyewitness encounters, some very modern. Reports are also found in the neighboring states of Alabama and Georgia, giving weight to the idea that the skunk ape is not an isolated phenomenon. Some reports state that encounters have been recorded as early as 1818, with scattered encounters taking place through the 20th century. In 2000, researcher David Shealy would capture a short video of a dark, upright, distinctly bipedal creature moving quickly through tall grass in the Big Cypress National Preserve, located in the Everglades. The footage has been subjected to varying levels of scrutiny, but proponents of its legitimacy cite the speed at which the figure was moving through the thick growth of Florida sawgrass. No small feat for any creature, human or otherwise. Expedient movement in thickly vegetated areas is a hallmark of many Sasquatch encounters. Also noted are the creature's height relative to the grass itself, as well as the animal's lean, wiry build. In accordance with Bergman's law, it makes sense that creatures living in humid, swampy areas might present a leaner build than specimens encountered in colder areas, such as Canada or the Pacific Northwest, a pattern noted by other researchers. The skunk ape's popularity has soared in recent years alongside the popularity of the Sasquatch niche, and has resulted in the creature receiving its own destination museum, gift shop, and research center. The Skunk Ape headquarters, located in Okeechobee, Florida, preserves the history of the skunk ape while offering tours and even a reptile exhibit. Like the Fouke Monster Mart of Fouke, Arkansas, the Skunk Ape headquarters serves as a living testament to the significance of the area's local folklore and the still unidentified creature at its source. The skunk ape and the sightings often associated with it are but a drop in the bucket of Sasquatch sightings to be found within the Sunshine State. Counties such as Brevard, Lake, Marion, Orange, and Polk boast sightings in the double digits, all populated areas with ample human observers, and all areas with long stretches of swamps and marsh. Florida itself is home to many natural wetland preserves, some very small, nestled amongst suburban neighborhoods, and many very large, which may serve as throughways for more populated spaces to more wild ones. To hear it from some locals, Florida may as well be just as much swamp as it is anything else, and one is never far from a marsh or marsh-like environment, and the creatures that hide within them. The skunk ape is said to be accompanied by a foul, overpowering odor, yet another hallmark of many Sasquatch encounters, and the feature from which it takes its nickname. Many witnesses have reported odors on par or greater to any skunk when encountering the creature, making it a distinct reference point for this particular aspect of Sasquatch phenomena.
The skunk ape, which I always tell everybody is the cousin to Bigfoot. My research has shown this is basically, seems to be the same animal. The only difference is the location. This animal stands about 8 foot tall. It's a light brown in hair, and I would say that the only difference is, the temperature down here in Florida is hotter and out in the sun, and maybe that is, lightened up the animal's hide. It does seem to have no fear of going in the water, but then again, I've read stories where Bigfoot up in the West Coast has been seen in the water too. The animal, like I said, it pretty much bears the same resemblance as of a Bigfoot. Sightings of this animal actually go back further than the California Bigfoot. And I only attribute that because settlers have been coming to Florida sooner than they were going out to California. So, when they started, dealing with the Native Americans down in Florida, specifically the Seminoles, they wholeheartedly believe in the skunk ape. I mean, there's no doubt in their mind that this animal exists.
If you look at the global picture of hairy creatures, there's all kinds of different things. The Yeti is different from the Bigfoot. Bigfoot, Sasquatch are the same thing, but in the southern United States, there's a concentration of sightings of an ape-like creature, and by ape-like, anthropoid, I mean that they have a different foot structure that looks more ape-like, like your hand, whereas the Bigfoot foot looks like an expanded human foot. They also are down on all fours more often. They're more hunched over. They're not as tall. They're more aggressive and different things like that behaviorally that show us there's something else going on down in the south than there is in the Pacific Northwest and some of the more forested areas of the United States.
My research showed that it actually first the term skunk ape got used in 1971 when an amateur archaeologist, H.C. Osborne, saw it out in the Big Cypress Swamp down in the Everglades. And he was quite adamant when the reporter was talking to him, and he was pretty much asking him about it, and he referred to it as the Everglades ape, and Osborne said, no, it's the skunk ape because of the smell. And it seems like right after that, every newspaper article right after that referred to it as a Florida skunk ape. Before that, it was either referred to as a wild man, or I saw it written down as the Everglades ape, but I never heard it ever called Bigfoot or anything like that. Of course, the obvious term why it's called the skunk ape is because of the foul odor that this animal emits. But it does seem that, it doesn't always happen. I've talked to some witnesses where they've seen it and didn't smell it. So this may be, I've done research where, gorillas, for instance, sexual pheromones, the males give off pheromones come through their sweat, whereas females urinate them through. So this may be the same thing that goes on with the skunk ape, because I've been out a couple times where I have, in an area where the thing has been seen, and I have smelled it. And the best way I can tell you, it smells like a wet dog, or one gentleman referred to it as an empty dumpster, but it's a really putrid smell. And you know, some people say that, you know, you smell it before you see it, whereas some people said they've smelt it and didn't see it.
A lot of the stuff I've noticed in some of these southern kind of Sasquatch or swamp Sasquatch trips and films that I've done, the behavior parallels a lot of the other purported behavior. So again, maybe aside from some of the appearance and like the height factor, which would make sense because of Bergman's rule, right? Animals closer to the equator, they get smaller. I've seen black bear in Florida that looks like a black lab size-wise compared to black bears that we get up here in New Hampshire, or, you know, up in Alaska, they get even bigger. So, you know, I think a lot of people want to think, oh, maybe the skunk ape is a different species or it's something of its own. I don't think that makes sense to me. I think it's just like you have black bears and mountain lions that are distributed widely in different habitats in North America, and they've also adapted to swamps. So why couldn't something like a Sasquatch hypothetically do that as well?
In fact, one of the oldest sightings of the Florida skunk ape took place in 1941. It was by a 5-year-old little boy, and he came in and he told his mom that there was a big hairy monster out there watching it. Well, Mom went out there and you know, just caught a glimpse of it walking in the woods, and this took place in the big in the green swamp located out north of Lakeland, Florida. And he said that that thing was just watching him, and then when he got up and ran inside, it took off walking. You know, I've heard other stories, you know, in Arkansas and Texas where, you know, they've got a mean streak in them. But, you know, the Florida skunk ape seems to be pretty docile. There's been some incidents where it's been, some hunters saw it and they started shooting off their guns up in the air to scare it off, and the animal took some sticks and stuff and started throwing sticks at it. There are some reports where one came out of the woods, and there was a gentleman on a canoe, and he was looking for an area where they were going to have a fishing tournament. And this thing came out of the woods and started yelling and screaming and caused the guy to capsize the canoe. And it just kind of stayed at the shoreline yelling and screaming at him. So he took, the gentleman took his oar over his head and started swinging it and yelling. And he said the animal just turned around and went right back in the woods. He thinks what happened was that you know, the skunk ape was out hunting, and it was looking for some wild boar, which in Florida we got an abundance of wild boar in our area. And when he came down with his canoe, he scared off the boar and inadvertently, you know, angered the skunk ape because he chased away his meal.
So when it comes to swamp habitats or environments that I think of in terms of the Bigfoot topic, obviously one of the big ones that comes to mind is like southern Florida, the Everglades, specifically the Everglades National Park area, and then some of the adjoining both national and state parks. So you've also got the Big Cypress National Preserve, which is run by the park system, which is, you know, hundreds of thousands of acres adjacent to the national park. You've got the Picayune Strand State Forest, the Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge. This overall habitat is like almost 3 million acres, I believe, if not more, of protected habitat. That's home to black bears, the elusive Florida panther, both alligators and crocodiles, one of the only places in North America where you get both of those reptiles in one place, as well as invasive species like the pythons and many other species, primarily birds and other things, but those are some of the larger animals. And that's where you have, of course, the stories of the skunk ape, just outside of Miami, a lot of that area, as soon as you start getting over to the Everglades, you have, you know, kind of what people consider skunk ape territory. So that's one area that definitely comes to mind. So aside from the Everglades and that southern Florida area, then of course some areas in North Florida. You've got the Ocala National Forest. That's an area that I've investigated a few times. There's a good amount of reports out of there. And then in the Florida Panhandle, you have the Apalachicola National Forest, which is also a massive environment where there's a history of sighting. So I think those three areas in Florida are kind of what I think of when it comes to, you know, skunk ape or Bigfoot stuff in the South.
We had a sighting with a hunter, 2012 Thanksgiving. He was in a tree stand when he saw the animal, as I call it, come walking out into a big, huge palmetto field, and he took out his cell phone and started filming. The thing looked up at him, and he said he felt a chill go down his spine when he realized it wasn't like a guy in a suit or a hunter in a ghillie suit, that it was an animal. And he's kind of just didn't know what to do because the thing was looking at him, he was looking at it, and then he didn't know if he should go for his gun or just keep filming. And then the thing just quickly just took off running. He said he couldn't believe how fast it was running. And he immediately got on the phone, his cell phone, and called his dad and his son to come over. And he was too scared to get out of the tree stand. He wouldn't. In fact, they said they had to coax him to come out of it. He was so scared. But later on, he came and saw me and his son, and they took me out to the location, and showed me where he was sitting, showed me where he saw it standing, and showed me what direction it went. And we did find footprints. The only problem is it had been a couple days and it had been raining out there, so the footprints were badly, damaged. I did try to take some castings, but unfortunately I didn't get any castings there.
Near the Louisiana bayou, another strange creature has been lurking within the marshes of the Honey Island Swamp. Honey Island Swamp is a rich marshland located in Tammany Parish, Louisiana, so named for the abundance of honeybees once found on the island. The Honey Island Swamp Monster would first be sighted in 1963 by an air traffic controller and amateur wildlife photographer named Harlan Ford. In 1974, Ford and a companion would discover large tracks in the Honey Island Swamp near the carcass of a boar that appeared to have had its throat cut. In 1980, sometime after Ford's death, a film reel was discovered amongst his belongings, which had been shot on an 8mm camera. It shows, what else, a large, darkly colored bipedal creature moving through the forests, in a display that makes a fitting companion to the Skunk Ape footage filmed by David Shealy. Ford would also cast a number of footprints allegedly left by the creature during his lifetime, many of them defined by having only 4 toes. While some of these prints are believed to be hoaxes, the legend of the Honey Island Monster lives on despite them.
After finding the home of Ricky Holofield, MK and I asked Ricky if we could see the shoe that Michelle had told us about in the Honey Island Swamp.
Making arrangements to get the shoe print to look at.
Bar, and it flooded. They found it on the bar.
That is cool. Let's take a good look at that. Yeah. Turn it around. Well, be doggone.
Pretty slick, huh? He's got
that it is.
One tip that broke.
But it wasn't broke when you found it, huh?
No. Now you got it put off. That is what they call the Honey Island Swamp football field.
I bet his eyes lit up when he seen this thing, didn't he?
Well, the guy, see this shoe? He walked up to the guy when he had this, and the man still wore the same type shoes. He said, I found the other set of shoes. I went out to set and found the other shoe. And it was that one. And the guy still had that same type of shoe on his
When we say the guy, what guy?
I don't remember his name. I can't remember. My dad could tell you all about it.
Was he an older fellow?
Yeah, he was.
Well, he may be dead by now.
I'm not sure. It hadn't been talked about in a while.
Well, I can see why.
Yeah.
Well, why talk about it now? If you don't talk, he lives on.
Yeah, they wrote on it in, I think it was Slidell News or Century News. It's a clipping somewhere around here. But I've walked, me and my family, we've walked that swamp from one end to the other.
Y'all have never seen anything
There's
like
no place in that swamp that I haven't been.
Yeah.
Have you ever?
Ricky couldn't remember the man they presented the shoe to, but later MK talked to the Holofield family and discovered that the man who the shoe belonged to was none other than Harlan Ford. It was Harlan that was shown the shoe, whereby he had no comment. The shoe, with its print, was identical to the shoes Harlan was wearing at the time. We have compared this shoe print to all known photographs and casts of the Honey Island Swamp Monster, and in each case, we've determined that this shoe is likely responsible for all the photographic evidence presented so far. Here's the shoe along with photographs of known Honey Island Swamp casts and cast photos, including the original casts cast by Harlan Ford. The shoe print is the same size and width of the casts. It bears the same indentions where the toes begin. Even the telltale tilt of the middle toe can be seen in comparison to this cast photo. The bends and arches of each toe can be easily seen represented in the casts. The print, offset from the shoe, creates the impression of a flexible foot when pressed into soft ground.
And then another area that I'm very familiar with that I've been to, I think 3 or 4 times now, is the Honey Island Swamp, which straddles the border between Mississippi and Louisiana. It's about 40-ish minutes north of New Orleans, near Slidell, Louisiana, and it follows the Pearl River, and you have a number of state and national wildlife refuges there, and that of course is home to an alleged creature known as the Honey Island Swamp Monster. Now that's a story that's been around for decades at this point. In Search Of did an episode about it. There's a lot to unpack with that story.
Oftentimes the Bigfoot seem to be migrating down. Now, I'm one of those individuals that tend to think there's a different kind of hairy creature in the South that's more chimpanzees-like. In Florida, it's called the Skunk Ape, the Honey Island Swamp Monster, boogers, all kinds of different names in the South. Those are not traditional Bigfoot. Bigfoot tracks tend to be 5 toes and like the human track in overall appearance that tend to be 14 to 20 inches long. The track of the southern ape-like creatures are like your hand. They look like a chimpanzee-like footprint.
The existence of 1 or 2 hoaxes does not negate the potential for a truly strange creature to be present, and eyewitness encounters seem to correlate the idea. Today, the Honey Island Swamp attracts a variety of visitors, including the avid Sasquatch researcher. It remains a destination for the enthusiasts, scientists, and legend trippers alike, as well as the many Bigfoot hunters who find themselves somewhere in the middle of all three. Louisiana has a long history of strange lore, frightening creatures, and dark legends, making Sasquatch an almost obvious addition to its impressive supernatural roster. Harlan Ford's legacy is preserved today by his granddaughter, who continues to research and speak about the topic. And of course, who can forget the timeless words of Smokey Crabtree? They always follow the creeks, uttered in the wake of one of the most famous sagas in the whole of Sasquatch history, the Boggy Creek Monster. In the 1970s, a quiet town in Arkansas near the Texan border would become famous practically overnight. In a narrative reminiscent of many small-town monster encounters, stories of the Boggy Creek Monster, so called for its repeated appearances in the Boggy Creek area of Folk, Arkansas, made such a dramatic splash in the local community that word of it spread like wildfire. A case so intimately linked with the legend of Bigfoot that it has inspired books, films, and even a store. It cast a template upon which many Sasquatch appearances would be repeated and continues to spark debate in the 21st century. Those seeking a response to the more skeptically inclined might be tempted to point to Boggy Creek as an example of independent witnesses in an isolated area having little to no motivation to lie, crossing paths with something truly inexplicable. The Boggy Creek Monster would make several appearances during its heyday, and some encounters were far more dramatic than others.
But I think it's safe to say in some of these swamp habitats in the southern U.S., there's a long history of sightings of strange, upright, hairy, man-like creatures. Probably most notably, aside from the Everglades and the story of the Skunk Ape, of course, you have Fouke, Arkansas. I've been there as well. with the Legend of Boggy Creek, that whole film that really brought the idea of Sasquatch-like creatures living in the southern U.S. It kind of put it on the map. It brought that idea to kind of a broader audience, which prior to that, I think a lot of people, especially in pre-1970s and 80s, if they had any awareness of Bigfoot or Sasquatch, it was primarily the Pacific Northwest. I think the Legend of Boggy Creek really was the first to break the mold of, hey, these things are actually east of the Mississippi and there's folklore and stories that do take place.
This area around here in Fouke is abundance of animals. You have your small animals, the squirrels, rabbits, raccoons, possums, and then you get into your foxes and your coyotes, and occasionally you run into a mountain lion. We've seen numerous signs, actually seen the animals in this area. You find the signs of the bear. We found the tracks, we found the scrapes. Have heard them, have not physically seen one, but you know they're here.
I was raised on a little 40-acre farm 1 mile north of here, and this was a small town, a lot of dirt roads, most of them dirt roads. And this place here actually was a cafe, and it was a little kind of a box cafe. It wasn't, this room back here wasn't there, and the other room on the other side wasn't here. And I actually worked in here washing dishes when I was about 6 years old, helped my grandma, and she cooked here as a cook for the restaurant. There's a lot of woods around, big woods up about 1.5 miles north of here that was a lot of wildlife in, big, huge timber, big pines, and it was some of our stomping grounds and some of the places we went to see, whatnot, done our hunting around. Of course, now the bottoms here, around the Mercy Bayou and Sulphur River bottoms, that remains pretty much the same as it's always been, because it's so uninhabitable. It's just, there's a lot of land no one's ever set foot on, I'm sure, back in there.
I saw the Legend of Boggy Creek when I was a kid, and I just thought it was neat. And I figured there was one creature and it might have died off or something, but
this wasn't something that was necessarily in the back of your mind
no,
at the time, or
no.
even thought about it.
I never thought about it.
And I think that's some of the misperception about this whole thing, because of the way the movie portrayed a lonely single creature that, for the average viewer that saw it, they felt that was a singular creature, and of course by logic it's probably long gone, it's died out. But if you lived here and had spoken to other locals, they had stories, and obviously this continued on, these type of sightings, which logic would have it that there would be multiple creatures, for this to exist, a small population.
Right.
Just based on that experience at least, what would you tell somebody that said, you've mistaken this, it was a bear, it was a raccoon crawling up the tree? What would you tell them to portray this as?
You can't tell people nothing. They can think what they want to.
Sure.
But I'd tell them, just go in the woods. Don't judge from your couch. You go down here. Walk in about 3 o'clock in the morning, sit somewhere, hunt like you're supposed to, and if something weird happens.
Resident Bobby Ford would receive medical attention, being treated for scratches and mild shock after his encounter with the creature. Ford's family would open fire on the creature, later stating that they had made multiple hits, but the monster left no physical evidence pointing to signs of injury in the wake of the encounter. Bobby claimed to have been assaulted by the creature during the harrowing nighttime shooting, which did nothing in the way of quieting the fears of an already excited community. This would be but one of numerous encounters recorded by the Ford family and other inhabitants of Fouke's Boggy Creek. The fame of the Boggy Creek monster would skyrocket, not only due to the frightening nature of the sightings and their frequency. A year after the string of strange encounters, a film was produced chronicling the saga. Director Charles B. Pierce chose the saga of Fouke and its decidedly boggy monster as the topic of his first feature film. The Legend of Boggy Creek would wow audiences, both made up of casual moviegoers and Bigfoot enthusiasts in search of the film. The film featured many of the original witnesses, who played themselves and assisted in reenacting many of the Boggy Creek monster's appearances.
Here in this primitive river bottom wilderness in southern Arkansas, along with deer, duck, crane, and beaver, lurks a creature that walks upright. Whether it is a man...
This unique style of storytelling, half documentary, half narrative film, would go on to gross over $20 million from a shoestring budget and a first-time director. An inspiration to filmmakers and independent artists of all shades, and of course, the Sasquatch community.
Whatever it is.
The film-centric legacy of Boggy Creek would also not end with Pierce's firecracker presentation. Multiple sequels were made to the original film. No surprise given its unexpected success, and modern filmmakers as well would latch on to its compelling saga. In 2016, Small Town Monsters, under director Seth Breedlove and with author and researcher Lyle Blackburn, would venture to Fouke in search of the Boggy Creek monster, producing a much lauded film by the same name. The documentary, which in the spirit of its predecessors was made on a scant budget by a group of dedicated friends and colleagues, and remains a frequent reference point to those interested in the legend. Still today, the Fouke Monster Mart preserves the legacy of the creature. A museum, gift shop, and pizza restaurant, the Monster Mart attracts thousands of annual visitors from all corners of the map.
There was truly a lot of people who claimed they didn't believe, but you would see them driving around the back roads of Fouke. Even my family went down there. There were people who were camping, who were breaking fences, who were camping on people's lawns. It became just, I don't see how the people of Fouke actually did it as gracefully as what they did, but they dwelt with so much intrusion amongst other people. And most of that was from people from not around here, but from people from other places. I know KAY, Little Rock radio station years ago, I offered a big sum of money for anybody who could get a picture or shoot it, and so it was, but the kids in school, they recognized there was another monster that came out about the time called Momo that was up in Louisiana, Missouri. And they're like, well, hey, they've seen the same things about their community as what we're saying here about ours. And so it became a thing where they became more believable. I know the stories I had heard around here. I grew up on Sulphur River down there, and the only thing I can remember really as a child, I can remember two instances. One, we had something behind one of our lakes back there that we had, howling as loud as you've ever heard. When he howled, you could feel your clothes doing like that. And so my dad went and got two of the farmers that lived down the road from us, and they took their guns and went down there, and by then it was gone. The only other time was there on the river. My dad was an amateur boat builder. And as we got down to Sulphur River at Falbus Landing, we looked, and there's, how Sulphur River works, and you'll get like a sandbar or something. Well, there was two little bitty, I called them monkeys, and not knowing any better, I was probably 5 years old. I said, look, Dad, there's two little monkeys. And he goes, yeah, son, look up on the hill. He said, there's Mama standing there watching. And I thought about that, and never did I even think about that being the Fouke monster, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it, until later on I started putting the pieces of the puzzle together. And then I began to talk to other people whose parents had sightings, and then others who had been in the woods, who'd heard things, who'd had things run them out of the woods. And then I realized, hey, this is a real, a real animal. But I still didn't believe until 1977, 72 or 73. I can't remember the exact time when that was coming. 71, 72, 73. It was a big topic. There was the Perot Theater was down there. It was actually called the Paramount, and there were people lined up for 6 and 7 city blocks down there to see this movie, because when it came out, it was so exciting. The people of this community were so excited they wouldn't let you know they were, but they were. And we waited probably 6 hours in line for tickets, and it was that way every single night. And so it's been a bunch of our local lore forever, but until it kind of hits you in the face, you really don't accept it. And especially when you're not a believer, and it comes to you, and you have a face-to-face encounter. And then, like I said, it was very humbling to me, because, like I said, it's 17 years old, fixing to graduate high school, and you know everything. Like I said, I realized I know nothing, and it changed the way that I look at things. I don't ever say never anymore.
There was other instances where I was hunting in probably 30-degree weather, hiked in 2 miles to hunt. And at daylight, mud was landing in my lap, And I'm like, where's this mud coming from? I'm 20 foot up in the tree. And then I hear knock, knock, knock. It sounds like somebody's in there chopping firewood. Never heard a boat come in early in the morning, so I'm passing it off as somebody in there chopping firewood. So I got down, left, crossed the big slough, which was almost dry, and there's one bare footprint at the end of it. None up this side, none up this other side, just one down at the bottom. And it was just a little bit bigger than my boot. Wasn't a 16, 18-inch track, just, you know, just a big, it was a big footprint, but I mean, it was fresh and it was 30 degrees outside. You know, I just passed it off as somebody took their boot off to try to cross this little water, you know, that's going through there. I don't know.
And I take it had 5 toes?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, it looked like a normal footprint. There wasn't no weird toes going all different directions or nothing. It just looked like a normal footprint.
Right. And I mean, I can be the first one to tell you, in those winter months down here, you would not want to take your shoes off if you got your feet wet.
Right.
You know, nobody, no hunter or hiker or anybody in here would have any reason to do that because your feet would very quickly get cold. So.
Right.
I have a cousin that has told me that he saw a beast, and he was scared by it. So that was kind of one of my first encounters of somebody telling me that something was out here.
What did you think of it when he told you?
I was a skeptic when he told me. He likes to joke and make fun anyway, so I didn't really believe him at first.
There's been many a times where I'd be sneaking in the afternoon right after lunch to do an evening hunt, and I'd see something. You know, wintertime there ain't hardly any leaves on these trees, so I mean you see a lot better. But there's many times where I've seen black things in the tree, then I'd pick up my binoculars thinking it was a black squirrel, because they're down here, and it's just cool to see one. But it looked like a black hand hanging off through the fork of a tree. I mean, it ain't close, because it just seems all that disappears if you get close. But there was one time whenever I was coming out of the woods, I think I did a morning hunt, and I was coming out, and I had my stand on and all my stuff, so I'm moving slow. That's me. I'm coming out of the woods, and if you hunted any, you know that squirrels, they'll jump out of the tree and hit the ground, whomp, and then you'll look over and they'll be running off. Well, this happened one time, and when it sounded like, just like that, squirrel jumped out of the tree and hit the ground. Except it sounded like it was about a 400-pound squirrel. And by the time I could turn and see what it was, all I saw was 10-foot tall bushes shaking. And something had jumped out of that tree, probably 30 foot high, hit the ground, and went through.
And to my knowledge, there's no 400-pound squirrels in the area. Have you seen any?
No, I haven't.
All right. In 2011, I had forgot my camera down in the bow. So my wife called and reminded me. I came down here to get my camera. And I was on my way to military duty, so I was still in my Army fatigues, had my jump boots on, all that stuff. Parked my truck, started heading down the bow because it's dry. It was a real dry summer, so the bow was dried up. And I got about 60 yards from the truck, and there was something knocked between me and my vehicle. So it was either there when I pulled up, or it had gotten there, you know, when I left. So I never heard that before. It was sequenced in time, 3. It's kind of freaky. Wood on wood.
Okay, and then you said you smelled something once.
I did, and that was the following summer. After, you know, deer season, all that was over, me and my wife had came down here and just driving around, looking, checking things out, seeing what was growing, seeing what was dying. We come down here, turn around, started to leave. Along the way, we'd smell something like a dead cow or something. It was just rank. It was bad enough that we had to roll the windows up. On the way out, I'm curious by nature. I decided to get out and investigate. Now the smell's gone. So within the span of 20 minutes, a dead cow got up and walked off. What else can you say?
Also on the roster is Okefenokee Swamp, located in Georgia. A tale from 1829 might make this the earliest known example of swampland Sasquatch on the record, predating the dramatic and newsworthy cases of the mid-century and the still compiling reports out of Florida and Louisiana. It is said that two men ventured into the Okefenokee swamp where they discovered a series of large, strange footprints, citing the length of the impressions at around 18 inches and the width as being close to 9. Potential Sasquatch footprints come in a variety of sizes, but it is safe to say that the creature of Okefenokee boasts feet larger than even the standard Sasquatch. As an example, average adult elephants leave footprints in the range of 15 to 19 inches in width, making one wonder just what sort of creature is hanging out in the swamp. The story was reported by a local newspaper, which caught the attention of nearby neighbors and prompted additional expeditions into the swamp. One of the original witnesses would lead at least one of these expeditions, discovering additional footprints, adding intrigue and credibility to the mystery. Since then, rumors and reports of Bigfoot-like creatures have circulated for decades, with modern encounters adding to the strangeness of Okefenokee's 700 square mile acreage. Some sources claim that local legends existed amongst Native Americans of fearsome giants lurking in the swamp, whom visitors were warned to stay away from. Ask around today, and it won't take too long to run across someone near the swamp with a strange story to tell. It is home to as diverse a variety of wildlife as any of the other areas where Bigfoot is also thought to be found, including large bears. While one might assume that early 19th century sightings could be written off to just such an animal, the size of the tracks, as stated, is well beyond the average for any woodland or swampland creature. Even assuming for hyperbole on the part of newspaper reporters, the tracks found in the swamp would still be something not easily explained away.
I think the reports of Sasquatch in swampy areas, in some ways, they are typical of any Sasquatch sighting, just sort of in general. This is a tall, upright, hairy creature that can walk on two legs. But over the years, I do see some characteristics that may set these apart. And I think that would be that oftentimes they're a little more hairy, more wild, even more ape-like. When we're considering swampy areas like Florida, the skunk ape is often thought of as being more ape-like in its anatomy. Another place that, of course, can't go without mentioning is Boggy Creek in southern Arkansas, a place where I've done a lot of research. And I think in that area, I've noticed again that these creatures seem to be more hairy, more scary, and prone to aggression as well. The legend of Boggy Creek, definitely has instances where these creatures attack. And, I think that might be indicative, all of this is indicative of the environment where, if you were covered in hair and dwelling in this hot, humid environment, you might be a little more aggressive if humans and things are invading your space, as well as, just adapting to that. So we have to think of these areas and swampy areas, especially in the South, as being a bit different than, say, the Pacific Northwest, where these creatures could be bigger. They could have a better life in the mountains that's more pleasant and beautiful. Whereas if you're in a swamp, you've got everything you need, but it is a challenge to survive.
The Florida panthers are endangered at the moment. There's tons of black bears down there, bobcats. A lot of the normal woodland animals you see exist also in these swamp areas. So it kind of reminds you, well, okay, these things have not adapted to have webbed feet, or they're not amphibious, or have become swamp dwellers. They're pretty much the same animals you would find, say, in the mountains of British Columbia as you would in Florida. They might be just a little bit smaller because you kind of have that Bergman's rule where closer to the equator, you don't really need to be as large due to the heat and all that stuff. So yeah, swamps and potential Sasquatch habitat. I think if these things are down there in certain swamp habitats, I think they've probably just adapted to it. just like all the other normal wildlife you see in other parts of North America have as well.
While the most effective form of research is to put boots on the ground, swamps present a diverse array of challenges to anyone on the trail of the hypothetical Bigfoot. As noted, the environment can easily be typified as hostile, and this condition exists year-round. Abundant snakes, some of them venomous, dwell in these thickly vegetated biomes. Larger predators are also a concern, such as wildcats and alligators. Never mind the vast array of illnesses one can contract from wading in bacteria-infested waters, untreated minor wounds, or being bitten by mosquitoes, ticks, and other parasites. Sun and heat stroke, dehydration, and exhaustion are a constant danger in any wild space, most especially in the hot human locales necessary to produce a swamp in the first place. Water. Water everywhere, and not a drop to drink. The terrain itself is often impassable without the aid of a specialized watercraft, and even the best equipped outdoor adventurer may find themselves quagmired, literally, when attempting to proceed through the untamed marsh on foot. The potential to become lost in the endless slog is yet another danger, requiring additional precautions and preparation. The cryptozoological researcher is not immune to these concerns, and we might argue that the accessibility of the environment has contributed to the ongoing mystery surrounding the swampland Sasquatch. It would seem the swamp is a perfect place to hide if one is adapted to survive there.
As far as investigations go, I've been in, most of my investigations have, of course, been in Florida involving the skunk ape. And again, I did a couple with the BRFO, and I've done some, some sightings we had over in the, what they call the Green Swamp. It is west of Orlando, and it is a hotbed for Bigfoot sightings or skunk ape sightings. And I've done some investigations up in Brooksville, which back in the 70s, Brooksville was a big hotbed for UFO and Bigfoot sightings up there. And I've been down in the Everglades, down there in that area. I get a tip on a sighting, go down there, interview some people, get a look at the area, and then, if it warrants it, we'll go ahead and I'll get my family, or I'll get some friends, and we'll go set up a camp area and start doing some patrolling areas, see if we can find any evidence, broken trees, footprints. Actually had something that was keeping pace with us when I was going down a dirt road to retrieve a trail camera, and you could hear it walking along in the water on the swamps over to our left, and every time we would stop, it would stop, and we could hear it breathing, and then it was making a gargling noise, which I know what bears sound like, and I know what panthers sound like, so this I couldn't identify, and my son even was with me. He was really wondering. And when he looked up at it with his night vision goggles, we saw glowing eyes looking at us. So we ended up leaving, because I didn't bring the proper equipment with me that night, because I was only out there to retrieve my trail camera.
Kind of in closing, when it comes to swamps, if you want to go research a swamp, it's a very difficult place. Don't just go for it. Don't just jump right into it, because you don't want to be miles into the backcountry and get bit by a cottonmouth and not really have a real good way of getting out of that situation. So know the risks. If you're not from the South and not from the swamps, don't underestimate a swamp, because they'll find lots of different ways to kill you. And I think the potential is there. I think some of the habitat in some of these areas is there. Maybe in the past there was more, but now with human encroachment, a lot of these places like in Florida and Georgia and other areas are getting developed. And I think unfortunately that's destroying a lot of the habitat and a lot of the other wildlife. But I would definitely recommend people, if you're in an area like Florida or Georgia or Mississippi, Louisiana, if you go to New Orleans, take a swamp boat tour up in the Honey Island Swamp. It's amazing. You'll see some great wildlife. You'll kind of understand the swamp a little bit better, and they're not these super creepy, very disturbing places. They're actually very beautiful. Again, I'm not exactly in my element when I'm in a swamp, because I'm much more at home somewhere in the mountains. But I like a good challenge, and every once in a while a good swamp is a good way to kind of make sure you're still alive and really getting out there and exploring some of the beauty that nature has to offer.
Well, I think these are challenging places. Swamps are not someplace that you can get easy access. You know, a lot of it, you need a boat. Even if there's, solid ground, throughout the area, some of that you can only access by a boat. And they're typically not places where your average person is going to go. This isn't a national forest you just drive up to, things like that. So you would have to have the right gear. It provides a lot of challenges, a lot of dangers. I mean, the cryptids are one thing, but in truth, what you're really worried about is alligators, venomous snakes, and just the terrain itself. I mean, even things like we think about quicksand, we all know that from movies, but I've literally stepped into places that, you immediately sink down, to your thigh. And, it's got all those sort of stereotypical challenges that you would have, when you watch these movies or horror movies or things, they have swamp settings. So I think Bigfoot research there is not as easy as it would be in some other places.
Despite the challenges, many do endeavor to search for the thing we call Bigfoot amidst the weeds, muck, and trees of North America's marshlands. Think only of the Skunk Ape headquarters of Florida as but one example. The environment may be challenging and potentially deadly, but it serves only as a minor obstacle to those with the proverbial dog in the fight. That is, the enduring passion that comes with the search for Sasquatch. After all, if there is something there worth finding, it may only be a matter of time until we find it, as long as we keep looking. At the end of the day, swampland Sasquatch may not be too different from their northern-bound fellows, though some differences in build and behavior have been noticed by experienced researchers. In some cases, they seem to be more aggressive, perhaps more irritable, than creatures noted in more temperate areas. Harkening back to the skunk ape and many of its fellows, swampland Sasquatch often seem to display a thinner, more wiry build, once again owning to Bergman's Law, which observes that animals in colder areas are generally larger than their southern cousins. Much in the way that squirrels in Florida are generally smaller than those found in more northern states, the swampland Sasquatch may run on the lighter end out of necessity. Less body mass equals less insulation, and the swamps of Georgia, Florida, and Louisiana are hardly an environment where one needs to conserve body heat. A slimmer anatomy might also aid the creature in skulking and sneaking between the thick vegetation, maintaining as much stealth as possible when making difficult treks through overwhelming undergrowth. Beginning at least as early as the 1800s, rolling through the 20th century and straight up to the modern day, there is a long and storied history of Bigfoot and his fellows lurking in the unexplored marsh. Whether the skunk ape, Boggy Creek monster, Honey Island swamp monster, or some other creature yet unnamed and undiscovered, it is not likely that we have heard the last of the swampland Sasquatch.
If you could rewrite that ending, how would you change it? Go full director mode in the comments.